Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Mattias Desmet, a professor of clinical psychology at the Department of Psychology and Educational Sciences of Ghent University in Belgium, and he works as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist in private practice. Desmet is the author of the books The Pursuit of Objectivity in Psychology and Lacan's Logic of Subjectivity, A Walk on the Graph of Desire. Furthermore, he is one of the founders of the Single Case Archive. In 2018, he received the Evidence-Based Psychoanalytic Case Study Prize of the Association for Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, and in 2019, he received the Wim Trieschberg Prize of the Dutch Association of Psychotherapy. I welcome Mattias Desmet to Savage Minds. I came across you in discussions about lockdown, and I am very concerned about what happened here where I am. We were the first Western country to adopt the China model of lockdown, which was quite surprising because, as you know, prior to lockdown, no Western country ever thought, let's do what China's doing when it came to human rights, psychological well-being. China was not the model for social contagion, let's put it that way. I wanted to start a discussion off with how this entire lockdown world seems to have been a slowly boiling frog effect, if you catch my meaning. That we were put into water, the heat was turned up, it felt warm, but we didn't notice we were boiling until months later. And the psychological destruction that lockdown has left someone like me, and I'm someone who's lived through quite a bit. I considered myself mentally healthy, stable. I think I've gone out of my mind multiple times since lockdown happened, both because of how cruel it was in Italy, the political ramifications for lockdown, and the fact that no one who is not extremely well off would be prepared for the kind of hardships that were to follow. Most people who are, let's say, the many renters of the planet, people who don't own property, who had to still cough up rent every month, despite many people not receiving checks, many people being left high and dry by systems. And it seems that those who devised lockdown didn't think at all about the poor. They took the poor for granted, expecting them to do the Deliveroo food deliveries, to do the Uber driving. But there was really no thought behind how lockdown would affect people with children, women who took a lot of the responsibility of the home education of these children, and then the brute force that this had on our economies. The economies, I don't mean of nations, but of small families, of large families, people with incomes that were shattered. You work in the field of psychology, and I'm wondering what you took as your first steps into this lockdown as someone who was, like me, in a European country, seeing things starting to get locked up. And then what was your first reaction to this lockdown?
To start really in the beginning, when I saw the first footage, the first images of China's reaction to a new virus, my first idea was that the virus probably was much more dangerous than China told us, because otherwise they would not take such dramatic measures to fight it. But it's strange, in a few days, and once the virus arrived here in Europe, once I started to study the statistics and all the mathematical models that were presented in the mainstream media and that were used to build the mainstream narrative and that were used as a basis for the corona measures, I very quickly I started to have the opposite impression. I started to have the impression that the dangerousness of the virus was dramatically overestimated and overrated. And I actually am a clinical psychologist, but I also have a master degree in statistics, and so I'm not a statistician. I don't call myself a statistician because statisticians do statistics as their job, and that's not what I do now. I have done that for a few years, but not at this moment. So, but I started to study the statistics and the mathematical models that were used, in particular the mathematical models of Imperial College. And yeah, from the first days of the crisis, from the first moments of the crisis here in Europe, I had the impression that the dangerousness of the virus was dramatically overrated. And there were several world famous statisticians who had the same impression. I'm thinking, for instance, about Ioannidis, John Ioannidis of Stanford University. But in my opinion, so the mathematical models of Imperial College estimated millions of deaths in the first months of the crisis if no dramatic measures were taken. For instance, in a country such as Sweden, they estimated that 80,000 people would die by the end of May 2020 if the country did not go into lockdown. And the country did not go into lockdown, and only 6,000 people died. I always give this same example because I think it's a very convincing example. So yes, that was my first impression, or my first reaction during the first months of the crisis. I immediately wrote some opinion papers warning that the fear or the anxiety for the virus could be more dangerous than the virus itself. For instance, in the beginning of the crisis, there were several large international institutions, such as the United Nations and several others as well, who warned us that the measures could claim more victims than the virus. For instance, in developing countries, more people could die because of starvation, could die from hunger, than the virus could claim, even if no measures at all were taken. So this shows us something strange. And in one way or another, all these warnings and these messages did not really have a large effect, which was strange, because it's something very basic actually to think about. If you consider different measures or different remedies for a problem, then the first thing you want to know, I think, is whether the remedies will not be worse, the cure will not be worse than the disease, so to speak. And in one way or another, this didn't happen. And at any time have we seen in the mainstream media a real comparison between the number of victims the virus could claim and the number of victims the measures could claim. And that's what we needed. That would be a rational approach to a pandemic, to just think about what the consequences will be of the measures and what the consequences can be of the virus itself. And then what we should have seen from the beginning were two graphs alongside each other. One graph showing the number of victims the virus claimed, and another graph showing the number of victims the measures could claim. But that didn't happen. At any time have we seen such a comparison of these two graphs?
Yes, and I'm alarmed because last night I went to my Facebook page about 5 days ago at most. I put on my Facebook wall a question. Now that more doctors and scientists are coming forth to question vaccines, not just the vaccines themselves, but the mandates, all of it, could all of you post information below that points to those who are speaking out? I asked a question. There was no link in my post. Facebook took it down. They took it down as against their rules. I asked a question. I posted nothing. Now, I'm coming from academia. I'm an anthropologist turned journalist. I was pretty shocked to learn about the foibles of mass media, the way in which you go about approaching stories. And one thing that was shocking to me was to learn that stories are approached not from a truth category, but from a what will people like popularity category. So skip back to last March, April of 2020, when I approached many editors with pitches such as, I'd like to cover the mental health aspects of lockdown. And I'd like to cover how the mental health aspects of lockdown are affecting families and women and children. All of this was no, 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 no. Major to minor publications said no. And the answer was pretty much the same. We can't run a piece like this, or it will look like we're against lockdown. Now, Mattias, this is insanity, because one of the most important parts of both science and media is ostensibly that you ask questions and you try to answer those questions. Now, those questions answered might be completely wrong. Then you go back and you do, if you're in science, another study. If you're in journalism, you write a follow-up piece. It's simple. It's not that hard. Yet early on, I noticed how we were being led down that pathway to do not question. And if you do question, the architecture was already being set up that you were definitely a right-wing nutter, conspiracy theorist. And I'm not even on the right, not even near the center. I'm very far left. And I was shocked by what was happening really early on. Left-wing papers telling me this, not right-wing, left-wing. And then similarly, I've interviewed two of the great Barrington declarants on the show, and Jay Bhattacharya has spoken out quite eloquently about the dangers that lockdown would pose to those in developing countries, even before first world countries, the economic harms. And then here we are, I'm in the West, and I suffered devastating effects economically of lockdown.
Wow.
So why is it that no one is allowed to talk about this? Is this part of the psychological landscape being set down for us?
To a large extent, I think. Of course, you could think it has to do with censorship, and maybe to a certain extent, it has to do with censorship. But I think, in my opinion, in the first place, it's a matter of self-censorship, and it's a matter of more unconscious mechanisms that are typical for a process that I call mass formation, which in one way or another make that people are not able anymore to really take a critical distance and to consider a narrative in a critical way. I think that's, for me, the major mechanisms that are at work here. And I think this mechanism of mass formation, I have been describing this in quite some interviews and podcasts. And I think it's something, well, it's something very typical for the tradition of the Enlightenment. Mass formation or crowd formation, if you want to call it like that, has always existed since thousands of years. But during the last 2 or 3 centuries, it became increasingly strong. And it lasted longer, the phenomenon of mass formation. So it's, in one way or another, it is related to the rise of the mechanistic view on man and the world. I describe this. I'm about to publish a book now in January about the relationship between the mechanistic ideology, mechanist materialist view on man and the world, and the rise of mass formation, crowd formation on the one hand, and then also totalitarianism on the other hand. And totalitarianism is one specific type of the totalitarian states actually is directly based on the phenomenon of mass formation, and that distinguishes it from a classical dictatorship. It's actually something completely different than a classical dictatorship, exactly because it's based on this process of mass formation. Now, I don't know if you're interested in going into this mechanism of mass formation.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Well, yes, well, as I said, a mass or a crowd is one specific kind of group formation that emerges in a society when very specific conditions are met. And there have to be 4 conditions, 4 typical characteristics in a population in order for large-scale mass formation to emerge. And the first one is that there has to be a lot of people who are socially isolated, so who lack social connectedness. And this was really the case before the corona crisis. For instance, the Surgeon General of the US mentioned that there was a real loneliness epidemic in the United States, and in countries such as the United Kingdom, a minister of loneliness was appointed, because over 50% of the people reported that they had no meaningful relationships at all. So there was really like that's the most basic precondition for mass formation to emerge. You have to have a lot of individuals that are socially isolated, or as Hannah Arendt calls it, I guess you know Hannah Arendt, the German Jewish philosopher who wrote this wonderful book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, and she calls it social atomized individuals, so people who are completely isolated and disconnected from other people. And then the second condition is that there has to be a lack of sense making, a lack of meaning making in life. So people have to feel that their life is senseless. And for instance, this was in particular clear at the level of the jobs of people. So in a recent Gallup World Poll estimated that worldwide 63% of the people considered their job as completely senseless or meaningless. And only 30% considered it really meaningful. So this shows, I think, the extent of the problem of the lack of meaning making. And the second condition follows from the first one. If people feel socially isolated, they usually will feel that their lives are meaningless and senseless, because people are really human, are really social beings, and if they feel no connection with someone else, they don't know what they are living for, and they don't know what they are working for instance. There are other aspects of this lack of sense making at the level of jobs as well, but that's definitely one very important aspect of it. And also there is David Graeber, a professor of from the United Kingdom, wrote a wonderful book about it, Bullshit Jobs, about this phenomenon of lack of meaning making at the level of work and jobs. So we have lack of social bond, lack of meaning making. Then the third condition is very important as well, is that there has to be a lot of free-floating anxiety and free-floating psychological discontent in a society. And what do I mean with that? Free-floating anxiety. That means anxiety that is not connected to a mental representation. When you are scared of a dog or of a lion or of something else that you consider dangerous, you know what you're anxious for, you know what you're scared from. But sometimes people are confronted with anxiety and discontent, which they cannot connect to a mental representation. And in that case, we call it free-floating anxiety. And that's the most painful kind of anxiety, because it's completely uncontrollable mentally, because you don't know what you're scared of. You lack any mental control over the anxiety, and the anxiety threatens to turn into panic, which makes it extremely painful on a psychological level. And the fourth condition is that there has to be a lot of frustration and aggression in society, a lot of free-floating frustration and aggression. So, and all these four conditions are all nicely connected to each other. If people lack social bond, they will lack meaning making and sense making in life, and they will experience a lot of free-floating anxiety and discontent, and in the end, they will feel frustrated and aggressive without knowing what they are frustrated and aggressive for. So if these four conditions are fulfilled in a society, then the society is extremely vulnerable to mass formation. And it happens in exactly this way. If under these conditions, narrative circulates or is disseminated through the mass media, for instance, in the population, then a narrative that indicates an object of anxiety and at the same time provides a strategy to deal with this object of anxiety, for instance, a virus as an object of anxiety, and a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, for instance, the lockdowns, then all this free-floating anxiety, the third condition, remember, all this free-floating anxiety might connect to the object of anxiety indicated in the narrative, and there might be a huge willingness in the population to participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. And in this way, people experience a psychological advantage, which simply is that their free-floating anxiety now is connected to a representation, and that they have a strategy to deal with the anxiety. So in that way, the anxiety becomes more controllable. And at another level, something even more important happens, because all these different people participate in the same strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. People feel connected again. They feel a new social bond. And that's why in all countries around the world, people mention, or everything seems to be about a new kind of citizenship and a new kind of solidarity. If you do not want to get vaccinated, if you don't want to participate in the lockdowns or in the social distancing or in the mask wearing, you show no solidarity with other people. So there's a new solidarity that emerges in a society, and that's and a new kind of social bond that is established. And at the same time, in the heroic battle with the object of anxiety, people also experience a new kind of meaning making. Yes. So what we see is this: people started in an extremely negative and painful mental state, and because of the mass formation, and because they all they all buy into the same narrative, this negative mental state switches to a positive mental state, to a symptomatic positive mental state. And why is it symptomatic? Because it's always destructive and self-destructive in nature. All the frustration and aggression, for instance, are directed at the people who do not want to participate in a mass or in a crowd. And that's an additional very strong psychological motivation to participate in a mass formation. So all these negative factors are switched and turn into something positive. This leads to a certain mental intoxication, which is perfectly comparable, even identical, to the phenomenon of hypnosis, which makes that people's attention is focused on one point, which means the danger associated to the object of anxiety. In this case, the virus, but historically, in the first half of the 20th century, for instance, the Jews or the aristocracy in the Soviet Union. All the psychological energy and all the attention is focused to this one aspect of reality indicated by the narrative that led to the mass formation, and all the rest disappears into darkness. And that's exactly the reason why people seem to be only aware of the victims that the virus could claim, and they are not aware at all of the collateral damage of the measures. It could be far worse, which is probably far worse than the damage that could be caused by the virus. So this brings people into a very strange situation, which if you didn't buy into the narrative, if you are not grasped in this process of mass formation, which makes everything seem utterly absurd, because it seems as if people suddenly only can see and are only sensitive to this one aspect of reality, and that all the rest doesn't count. So that's exactly the same as in hypnosis. It makes, for instance, this focusing of the attention as a consequence of the process of mass formation is extremely strong, also comparable to hypnosis. And to give one very good example, if a simple hypnotic procedure is sufficient to focus the attention of someone so much on one aspect of reality that you perfectly can perform a surgical operation and that person will not notice it. That happens time and time again when hypnosis is used as a procedure during surgical operations. A simple procedure, focusing the attention, hypnotic procedure, focusing the attention of someone on one small positive aspect of reality is sufficient to allow the surgeon to cut straight through the flesh and bones of the person without noticing it. And that's what happens in mass formation. That was so typical for the totalitarian states of the first half of the 20th century, that people seemed to be not aware of the personal losses they suffered because of the totalitarian regime. That was what historians noticed time and time again. These people are completely unaware. They seem not to realize that they are heading for radical self-destruction. And for instance, Stalin killed 50% of his own party members, and those who were condemned, usually without any reason, they accepted their fate, they accepted the sentence, and without objecting, were brought to death. So that's something extremely typical for mass formation. There's this hypnotic effect, which we see now. I think people don't realize that they lose their freedom and that they lose their entire future in the end.
It's interesting what you've pointed out about both the statistics of loneliness prior to lockdown, the fact that we've all been trained in loneliness since the advent of the internet, each year, more and more hours spent online. The shocking lack of any kind of public awareness, just like we saw this with video games. Parents, be careful about how many hours your kids spend on Nintendo. But the internet somehow was never to be cautioned. It was always okay, even though, and I've pointed this out many times, but friends of mine who practice psychiatry or psychology have now had to adopt the practice with patients. When a patient says that they have a new boyfriend or girlfriend, they have to ask the person every time, have you ever met this person in real life? Because they were shocked by some instances with patients that they would be talking about months-long relationships where they never met the other person. I'm thinking to Elias Canetti, who wrote, for me, one of the most brilliant books of the 20th century, Crowds and Power.
I read it. Yes, it's here on my desk besides me.
Oh, brilliant. It's a wonderful book. I've taught this. I taught this at Goldsmiths, in fact. And he says the crowd emerges from the need of the lonely individual to conform with others. But because the individual cannot exert a form of dominance on his own self, he exerts it through the crowd that speaks with one voice. I'm paraphrasing Canetti here, where the crowd's urge is always to grow larger, consuming all the hierarchies, even if it feels persecuted and demands retribution. The crowd sees itself as entirely pure, having attained its highest virtue. This is shockingly familiar, given what we've seen on social media over the past 21 months. I highlighted a tweet earlier today by someone who has several 100,000 followers who tried to shame people who don't take the vaccine, saying that it is an act of solidarity to take the vaccine. And then I kept thinking back to Terry Gilliam's brilliant film, Brazil, where throughout the movie, the logo of this very totalitarian society that we're witnessing is, we're all in it together. And I've heard this in the UK, we're all in it together. Whoa, I feel like I'm living a science fiction dystopia. And I feel very down since realizing how dystopic things are. I mean, the virus in the early weeks, at first I was like, oh, this must be very serious. We'll have to conform to these codes. Let's hope in 14 days we'll have some news. But quickly it was evident that this was not the bubonic plague. This was not any form of plague, that the mortality rate was larger than flu, but that suddenly flu statistics were being wiped out. They weren't being recorded. I'm sure you must have something to say on this as well, with the fact that in some countries, they're not reporting flu. So we're being frightened to death into conformity, and much in the way that Canetti discusses how the crowd seeks to control through its collectivity. This is frightening to me, where he says that the intrusion of power is, I'm quoting him, is like a knife cutting into the flesh of the victim. The questioner knows what there is to find, but he wants actually to touch it and bring it to light. So we get all these tweets saying, well, that guy, there'll be an article about a man who refused to believe that the virus was serious and he dies. So you get like the Guardian, it's always a left-wing paper running a story saying COVID denier dies. And then everyone their job on social media is to finger wag and say, see, he died. You've seen this, I'm sure, right?
No, I didn't see that in particular, but I recognize it immediately. Yes.
And there's a lot of similarity between with what Canetti's project does and Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, where she also looks, in a sense, she doesn't look at crowd psychology per se, but she looks at political order. And we're living in an era that some people call totalitarian, others call authoritarian. And most people who will be listening to this probably will nod their heads. Others might be writing me an angry email saying, you're denying the virus. But we are in this very strange paradox of those who are the cowboys in the white hat and those cowboys in the black hat. You're good, you're bad, nothing in between.
Indeed. But this is, of course, I think it's a classical example of large-scale mass formation. I think so. And also Hannah Arendt, she does not really give a psychological description of mass formation, but she acknowledges that totalitarianism intrinsically is based on mass formation. That's the difference with the classical dictatorship. In a classical dictatorship, people are scared of the dictator because of the physical power of the dictator. Let's call it like that. So because of the physical power, because they are scared of the physical power of the dictator, they allow the dictator to impose his social contract one-sidedly to society. But a totalitarian regime and a totalitarian state is something completely different. A totalitarian state emerges from the belly of the population. It emerges from the first step of totalitarianism always is the formation of a crowd or a mass, which is fed and by the mass media, and from which slowly a totalitarian regime emerges, as we are witnessing now, I think. And an ideologically driven totalitarian regime. Totalitarianism, in the end, is always ideologically driven. It's a blind ideology, the blind conviction that the society should be reorganized according to one or another scientific or pseudo-scientific ideology. That's always the case. People forget that totalitarianism always is based on the blind belief in a scientific ideology, which very quickly shows that it is radically irrational and shows a radical contempt for the facts. Hannah Arendt says the statistics and the graphs that are used by the totalitarian regimes, they always prefer to use statistics and graphs to prove that their approach to society is the best, or that their take on a certain problem has to be preferred above others. But in the every time and time again, we see that the statistics and the graphs show a radical contempt for the facts. That's something Hannah Arendt mentions in The Origins of Totalitarianism. And what we are witnessing now, I think, is a new type of totalitarianism, not the mob totalitarianism, as Hannah Arendt calls it, of Hitler and Stalin, but a technocratic totalitarianism, which is led by dull bureaucrats and technocrats. It's unbelievable, incredible that Hannah Arendt mentioned this already in 1951. She said, we've seen the decline and fall of Hitler. We will witness the fall of Stalin probably in the nearby future, she said, or of Stalinism. But she said, we will see the rise of a new kind of totalitarianism. And this new totalitarianism will be a technocratic worldwide totalitarianism. I've often wondered how she could know that in 1951, and now I think I understand this better. And I describe in my book what I think the basic mechanisms are at work here. But indeed, I think that's a classical example of the emergence of totalitarianism we are witnessing now.
Yet so many people, if you go to my Facebook wall, it will make you either laugh or cry some days, because people believe that we are being duped, that we are denying the existence of the virus, that we are anti-science, simply for saying, again, talk to Ioannidis, who's done some great work on this as well, but why, if a vaccine that is supposed to work is it necessary that one, it's still people who are vaccinated are still carrying the virus at the same rate as those of us who are not? So how selfish are we? Isn't it more selfish to get the vaccine since you're protecting yourself? I mean, if you really want to follow the selfish argument. And this is really put on a pseudo-religious platform where we are being forced to declare our virtue by reason of our having committed to a vaccine that is, as most scientists are now saying, quite leaky. It's not really a vaccine if you start to read more and more of the literature, because a vaccine should be able to actually prevent transmission, which it's not doing. It lightens the effects of the illness when one gets it. But even to question this, you are put into the area of Pol Pot, Stalin, take your dictator. You are an evil person, and the debate shuts down. Now, from a psychological level, and I'm thinking back to Canetti as well, but what is driving? Is it really that the loneliness, the online living that we're all doing since lockdown? What is contributing to this need for people to get on their computers and hammer out anger?
Yes, but that's, even in the 19th century already, people such as Gustave Le Bon, one of the major scholars on mass and crowd formation, he wrote this wonderful book, which has been translated in English, in which the English title is The Psychology of the Crowd. And he describes already in the 19th century that one of the major characteristics of crowds or of masses is that they show a radical intolerance for dissident voices, for alternative voices. So, and I think Gustave Le Bon doesn't explain that, but I do explain it in my book. It's actually something that's quite easy to understand, because the mass formation starts from this highly negative, aversive mental state, which we described in the beginning of the interview. So these four conditions: the social isolation, the lack of sense-making, the free-floating anxiety and discontent, and then the free-floating frustration and aggression. So the process of mass formation makes people switch to the opposite state, to a state in which they are highly connected to each other. And every time they hear a dissonant voice, they hear a different voice, they threaten, the mass formation threatens to disappear, because mass formation is a phenomenon that is constantly created by the voice of a leader. So that's why totalitarian states always start the day with a half an hour of propaganda. So mass formation is a phenomenon, just like hypnosis, in which someone is grasped into a mental state which is provoked by the voice of someone. And if they hear dissonant voices, people threaten to wake up, and they threaten to be confronted again with the initial discontent. All this free-floating anxiety, frustration, aggression, lack of social bond. So that's the first reason. Why people are angry and why people are radically intolerant for dissonant voices. But there is a second reason as well. The fourth condition is that people have to experience a lack of frustration and aggression, and this frustration and aggression is typically directed at, is typically channeled, is typically satisfied by directing it at the people who do not go along with the masses. So the masses always demand conformism. They want everything to contribute, to participate in a mass formation. They always seek an object who is typically made the object of frustration and aggression. So every time they hear a dissonant voice, they do two things at the same time. They prevent the dissonant voice of waking them up, and at the same time, they make the dissonant voice the object of frustration and aggression. And in this way, it's like an object of enjoyment or an object of satisfaction. So these two mechanisms, or the two major mechanisms, I think, that explain why the masses are always radically intolerant for dissonant voices.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. And yet, from the other side, where you have people wanting to take part in this project because it gives them something, even in a way, I'd say it makes them forget that they're part of this totalitarian system. There's people like myself who I'm seriously waking up in these weeks to the fact that I feel like we've been put in a horrific social experiment. My children suffered, I suffered, my wife suffered gravely. This was horrific. We didn't know where we're living. We had to look to the internet every time we walked out the door to download a new form, to print it out. We had to look and see what lines we could cross and for what reasons. It was crazy. I would have rather been in prison because at least there's one rule book in prison. You don't have to worry about going to cell block B because you know you can't go there. So why are we seeing even today from not just major media, independent media, because the places I pitch stories to were often independent media. Independent media is not wanting to address a psychological toll of what this pandemic has meant. It's not just lockdown. My wife said to me today, in fact, lockdown was 2 months. And I was like, no, it wasn't. It's been this protracted off and on. We don't even know when it's off or on anymore. That's the torture of it.
No, indeed, of course. Yes, yes. You have to read Solzhenitsyn. Totalitarianism, he describes it in, I think, chapter 4 of his wonderful book, The Gulag Archipelago, where he describes how the rules change so often in a totalitarian state, just as a consequence of the psychology of totalitarianism. The rules change so often that in the end, there seems to be only one rule, and it is that there are no rules anymore. No, there are rules, but there are no laws. There are no laws. So there are no stable laws that exist and that protect, that give a minimal protection and a minimal regularity to life. But that's extremely typical. Yes, there's confusion at the level of rules, which actually in the end makes the state almighty and without limit in exercising its power. Yes.
Yes, and we were constantly put on this unsure footing as to where, when, or how we could go somewhere. Now there are mandates in many European countries such that in Italy, you can't travel for more than a certain distance without the green pass. When I was in France this summer, I couldn't go to an amphitheater, outside amphitheater, because I didn't have their newly unveiled green pass. And you begin to look at this and think, this is outside. This is the least contaminatory space possible. And again, all the rules that are still in order, I have to bring each of my children to the school at a different time because of contamination. I have to laugh at this because there's zero science to this. So my first grader goes in at one time, and my daughter who's in third grade goes in at another. There's zero science because they're both contaminating the school in two different grades, just as other families with 2 or 3 or 4 kids. And yet, nobody is pushing back on this. Nobody officially pushes back on this at all. It's all it's just like what I quoted from Brazil earlier. We're all in this together. It's this idea, we're doing our bit. Let us stand outside a school in a pouring rain for 15 minutes every day because we have the misfortune of having 2 different offspring, you know?
Yes, I know. So, no, I think that the politicians who would want to push back have a very difficult time. I think in one way or another, it's almost impossible, or it's at least it asks that you want to lose your career and your public function, I think. But I think we can do something. In the first place, I believe that we have to continue to speak out. This is so important. If there is no dissonant voice anymore, if there is no opposition in public space anymore, then the hypnosis will become more and more deep, and the crowd will typically commit its atrocities, which it is famous for. So we have to continue to speak out, and we have to connect not only with the other people who identify, or who, for instance, not only with people do not only have to connect with the non-vaccinated, they have to connect with the vaccinated as well, who are open to connection, because only a small part of the population is really into the process of mass formation. It's probably not more than about 30%, but there is an additional 50 or 60% maybe who goes along with the masses. That fluctuates a little bit. Sometimes it's 40%, sometimes it's 50, sometimes it's 60%. So, but only 30% is really into the process of mass formation, and there is then a 50 or 60% who goes along with the masses. But of these 50 or 60%, many of these people are not totalitarian in nature, or they are open to connection, and that's really important. We have to connect as much as possible to form small overlapping circles, for instance, to create a network of circles of about 10 persons maybe, who overlap and who form one large network. That's one thing. And we have to speak out as much as possible. Wherever we can, we have to speak out in a quiet, sincere and honest way, telling that we don't share the same perspective as maybe most people do. That's so, at the psychological level, that's quintessential, because it's clear that when the opposition is completely silenced in public space, that is exactly where the totalitarian state starts to commit its atrocities, its absurd atrocities. That happened around 1930, I believe, in the Soviet Union, about 1935 in Nazi Germany. At that moment, for instance, in the Soviet Union, Stalin started his large-scale purifications, he called it, of society, in which he destroyed or he eliminated the one social group after the other. First, there was a certain logic in it. After a while, there was no logic in it at all. It was merely at random almost. He eventually killed 50% eliminated 50% of his own Communist Party members as well. So that shows us again, if people stop to speak out, the system becomes absurd, and it becomes, as Hannah Arendt calls it, a monster that devours its own children. That's how she calls it. That's so important for the people to realize that it's not because you go along with the system that you will be spared by the system. The system will destroy you as well. It will destroy everyone. So and as Hannah Arendt says it, this typically starts at the moment there is no opposition anymore. So we have to continue to speak out for ourselves and also for the people who are into the process of mass formation. That's one extremely important thing. The second one, as I said, is to connect with each other. The third one is that when we try to construct an alternative narrative, I guess we all have to construct our own alternative narrative so that we do not become a mass ourselves, so that we become a group of individuals who all speak at their own best understanding and knowledge. And as we do that, we have to make sure that we do not try to convince people to go back to the old normal, because that won't work. The old normal was exactly the reason why the mass emerged. The old normal was this state in which people felt socially isolated, felt that their job was a bullshit job, were confronted with this free-floating anxiety and all this frustration and aggression. So it makes no sense to try to convince people to go back to the old normal. What we have to do is to try to show people that the new normal should not be the new normal of Klaus Schwab or of one or another transhumanist ideology. That's what we have to try to show people, that there is possible that the new normal can be a new normal in which people are free. 90% of the jobs is completely senseless. So we should stop with these bullshit jobs, and we should make sure that people earn as much money as they earn now with working only 10% of the time, because that's perfectly possible.
We are seeing very few implementations of the reduced work week. We're seeing even less sharing of resources, because what lockdown evidenced was the haves from the have-nots. And I don't just mean Jeff Bezos, but let's talk about people like Jeff Bezos. Let's talk about multiple home dwellers who, it's shocking to me how people who were born into the good fortune of having been given a home by their parents, as is often the case in Italy, the government in Italy never once thought about renters until almost a year after lockdown happened. And even then, you talk to people and they haven't received any help. This is shocking to me that the first thought were the mortgage payers, people who own property. This was all about keeping a certain infrastructure afloat while forgetting about the poor. And I'm very bitter about this myself because I even had a hard time getting renters on record. They were afraid. There was a rent strike in Bologna. People were afraid to give me even their first names. There is a fear of impunity from the system that these people depend upon. The same thing in France and in the UK. Surprisingly, renters in New York have been able to have much more power by unionizing, joining forces, and fighting the system there. But I'm really alarmed by how lockdown evidenced the haves from the have-nots and how the left became the more totalitarian class, where people on the right, I'm generalizing here, but I'm shocked to watch people like on Fox News, American news channel, which is very right-wing, they are showing more concern for the poor in every way.
That's true. Yes, I think there is one problem with the left-wing political parties. When they are confronted with mass formation, they usually mistake solidarity for conformity to the masses. That's their problem. That's what they are so sensitive for. And they in one way or another, they feel that going along with the mass, with the crowd is an act of solidarity, which of course it is not. True solidarity does not need a scapegoat. It does not need to destroy a social group. But masses always need something to destroy. And that's exactly why they are self-destructive in the end, because if they destroyed the one group, they will definitely find another group. And they continue like that until everybody is dead if you don't watch out. So that's the reason, I think, why. So, for instance, Hitler in Nazi Germany, he started with the people who were with physical limitations, then the Jews, then the Polish people. But he planned to continue with the Germans themselves. All the people first, all the Germans with heart problems should be eliminated. Then all the Germans with lung problems. He had a whole list. So first he started with people with physical limitations, and the Jews, then the Polish people, and then he planned to go after the Germans with heart problems, then the Germans with lung problems, and so on. And he would not have stopped before he killed every German. That's also what he promised, like that he put enough gas aside in case Germany would lose the war. He had a painless death for every German. So, but anyway, there is something self-destructive. And then if you understand the psychological mechanism of totalitarianism and of mass formation, it's very easy to see why it is like that. So, for instance, the leaders of the masses, the leaders of the crowd realize that they always have to indicate new objects of anxiety that has to be destroyed, because if they don't, the masses will wake up. Because the reason why the masses exist is, or why they buy into the story, the narrative, is because the narrative indicates an object of anxiety that consequently should be destroyed, and that gives them a reason to satisfy their frustration and their anger. So if the leader of the masses stops indicating objects of anxieties, the masses do not have a reason to exist anymore, and the masses will wake up. And what happens then? As soon as they wake up, they look around them, they see all the collateral damage and the destruction that has happened, and they kill their leaders. Always. That's what Gustave Le Bon describes already in the 19th century. He describes everybody who takes the lead of the mass better prepares to be killed. And that's exactly the reason why the leader can't stop, why he has to continue, and why in the end, the process of mass formation is always self-destructive. And that brings us to something else that is very important. Everybody who is not buying into the story now, everybody who is outside of the mass, has to realize that he does not have to that he doesn't have to destroy the mass, or that he doesn't have to destroy the system. The system eventually will always destroy itself. The only thing we have to do, I think, is to continue to speak out, to make sure that the process of hypnosis doesn't become that deep that the masses become completely blind and destructive, and then wait until the system weakens itself. And it will, definitely, it will.
Do you foresee people holding their leaders to account in such a violent way as we saw in eras preceding us?
That's very well possible, but of course, well, we could try to prevent them from doing so. I think the punishment of the leaders will be severe enough if they just have to continue to live being confronted every day with the damage they caused. At least I don't feel like they should be killed, but if the masses wake up, that might be a consequence, yes.
Well, it is shocking to me that we were seeing the leaders of Australia and New Zealand being touted as somehow these true, forceful, loving of their people leaders. And there was never a question about the tactics that were being used. And I'm thinking of what's happened to the entire country of New Zealand, and most especially Melbourne, where they've been under an extremely harsh lockdown. Mental health is barely mentioned in any of this. And I worry about the future of people, the toll this takes on people who are being expected to work from home and homeschool while also doing all these other things. It's insanity. They're trying to push people to the brink, it seems, of a breakdown, such that in a way, one must wonder if the authoritarians running the show are creating their own backup story, saying, well, people were crazy. You know, they like to say mass violence in the States is all because of one crazy armed gunman. But it seems that lockdown is creating a lot of mental unhealth, and it's affecting so many of us. It's causing stress. It's causing lack of sleep. People are worried about their finances. People are moving back home, thus having a new level of living with their elderly parents, and they're in their 40s and 50s. These are things that are happening, and people are very unhappy, and they're unable to put together the vocabulary of what totalitarian has been unfurled before us all and their reaction to it, in the same way that other people are able to not see that lockdown has created much of their mental strife, because a lot of people don't react to politics head on. A lot of people will say, oh, it's just a hard time for me. Some people are not putting together the struggles they're going through with lockdown. So I begin to wonder to what degree that the being overworked, the not eating, not sleeping is going to affect people in different ways, such that only those politically aware will react to their leaders. And maybe the rest will have other kinds of outcomes, because many people say, well, I'm not a political person.
It's hard to predict, I think.
It just seems so shocking to me that in this era, you have so many people that have said on social media and elsewhere, people said, how could this have happened? And they point to Nazi Germany and they're like, this is how it happens. This is how it happens. We're all being convinced that a virus that isn't the plague is going to kill us all. And people are cheerleading the destruction of our economies, the health of people who can't get cancer treatments, and
the loss of their freedom.
Yes. So have you seen any kind of data that is adding up the mental ill health?
No, it exists. I've sometimes I've seen some data, but not comprehensively, or not something like a real overview of the impact of the measures on mental health. No, but that's also it's very hard to really describe that and to really measure that, I think, because everything happens at the same time. Many people actually do feel better mentally because of the lockdowns, exactly because of the mechanism that I just described, because they feel connected again, they feel that life makes sense, they feel also freed from their bullshit jobs to a certain extent. I talk to many people here in my street, and many of them somewhere mentioned that, well, at least it's terrible what happens, but at the same time, we can step out of the rat race for a moment because of the lockdowns and the online work and so on. So I think it's quite hard to gauge or to measure what the exact impact of the situation is on the mental health of people. In the end, it will be very destructive, that's for sure. But in the beginning, it can be a symptomatic solution for some of the mental health problems.
Well, there's also a conflation between what the powers have done to us in terms of making the lockdown and who's giving us the information. I'm sure you've seen how Fauci went from being someone we never really heard of, unless you followed closely AIDS in the 1980s in the US and the CDC, to someone who became this patriarch of all things COVID. He seemed to be, and this is a very strange thing, Mattias, because never before in American news have I seen that there's one person that you go to for all the things. Never.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
in the past 21 months, we've seen him and Bill Gates in this very bizarre mise en scène from CNN given to us on a daily basis. A dozen articles on him. It could be a dozen on Gates. There were days there were so many Gates articles, it was frightening. And to paraphrase one MP from the UK the other day, she said, basically, this is the kind of stuff that gives conspiracy theorists reason to distrust.
Mm.
It's almost an own goal where the authorities in various countries had their own Fauci. In the US, it was one person. In the UK, it was Sage. They used Dominic Cummings at one point. What is happening where political leaders are being put in front of the cameras? They're giving us updates like Boris did every night or his people did every night. And then on the other hand, what happened last week in Italy, there's a journalist, Fabio Fazio, who did something that's really quite shocking. He postured himself as a politician, pushing a politician he was speaking to push for the green pass and to have it on all public transport, even those that it's not obligatory on today, where media folks and journalists are now taking on the power of an elected official. They, of course, are not elected. And they're introducing this kind of de facto power onto themselves. And nobody is stopping this. And we've seen this. Look at what happened to Chris Cuomo in CNN the other day. He got axed because now we find out there were inappropriate dealings between him and his brother's office, the governor of New York. And there are still more questions to be asked as to why we were given one man in the United States who sort of became that world leader for many, Dr. Fauci, where we are told that one person gets to decide, but where are the political leaders? Why are talking heads speaking? Why are interviewers and journalists taking on this power? It's a very perverse form of totalitarianism.
It is. But at the same time, yes, it's no surprise, because that's exactly what from the 19th century already. Once the masses became increasingly strong and the mass formation became increasingly intense and longer lasting. From then on, like also Gustave Le Bon also described it, it starts to become more powerful than politicians and it takes over society. That's exactly what happens. Yeah, that's yes, indeed. I can only agree. It's a strange phenomenon, but it's very real. Yes.
Yeah, well, people are definitely progressing their hopes of the future with these talking heads on TV, with political. Oh my gosh, every time that there's a new decree or a new law or a new order that is passed, I'm seeing people jubilant over this. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with you? Yes. People are cheerleading their own oppression.
Yes, of course. Yes. Definitely, yes. They switch from an age of extreme individualism into radical collectivism, where the individual sacrifices itself in favor of the collective. That's what's happening in a mass. And that's why the corona measures actually are kind of rituals. That's exactly the function of a ritual. A ritualistic behavior is a kind of behavior which has no pragmatic meaning, which is absurd from the practical point of view, and which demands a sacrifice of the individual. And through such behavior, the individual shows that it considers the collective more important than itself. And that's what's happening now. People, after an age of individualism, want to be freed of themselves. They suffered from themselves. They suffered from their freedom. They were scared of their freedom. And now they show that they have only one wish, and it is to be liberated from themselves and to disappear in the collective, to show that they sacrifice their lives, their freedom, everything in favor of the collective. That's one perspective you can take on this crisis when it as to what happens on a psychological level.
And you think that the only way of responding then is to be a dissident voice,
Yes.
even a dissident actor, I presume, because we're seeing a lot of people push back and say, no, I'm not going to get the vaccine. And in certain cases, hospitals are obliged to keep these workers on because they don't have replacement for them.
Yes, non-violent resistance is very effective against totalitarianism. Hannah Arendt describes this in her book. I don't know if it is The Origins of Totalitarianism or it might be Eichmann in Jerusalem. I think it's the last one, Eichmann in Jerusalem. But non-violent resistance is extremely powerful because when you use violence against the totalitarianism, it will always get more aggressive itself. But non-violent resistance is very strong. It's very powerful to counter totalitarianism. And in the first place, that means continue to speak out in public space and to show that you not agree or that you do not blend into the mainstream narrative.
Well, it seems that the era we're living in is one that will be completely divided, always. People in our thinking are going to say, well, you're causing danger by asking questions. This is a serious virus. If people hear you speaking,
yes.
They might not get vaccinated. This is their rationale, that we're
yes.
causing disease by speaking.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Yes, we have to counter argument as well as possible. We have to show the irrationality. We have to show that when a democracy does not allow freedom of speech anymore, that it cannot be considered a democracy anymore, but that in that case, it is a tyranny of the majority. That's how Aristotle called it already. And other philosophers after him, I forgot the name of the one I had in my head now, I don't know. But when in a democracy, the majority does not give fundamental rights such as freedom of speech anymore to minorities, then it is not a democracy anymore. So we have to think about it and present as clear and convincing arguments as possible, showing the importance of other perspectives or dissonant voices. And it will not help in this sense. It will not wake the people up. But if we continue to speak like this, in a sincere and quiet way, and in an as rational as possible way, with arguments that are as good as possible, then you will see that people will continue to consider us as human beings. Because the difference between an animal and a human being exactly is that an animal doesn't speak and a human being speaks, and the human being has a capacity, be it very limited, of rationality, of being rational. And we have to continue to behave like human beings. And in that way, we will be a counterforce to the dehumanizing trend that is always present in a totalitarianism and in a crowd.
For many people, including myself, this is utter insanity. I have a hard time some days dealing with everything that's happening, because it's really hard psychologically. You can be strong and you can know that this is wrong, but you're still living in this world of leaving your house, looking at people. Like, I'm in Italy, so there's a lot of people in my town who are elderly who believe this nonsense, and they are fearful and they wear 2 masks on top of each other. And then you've got people who know it's absolute nonsense, but they don't want to speak out because they don't want to get into trouble.
Yes, I know.
So you have to go even further. You have to look by the people who believe it, the people who don't and won't speak out, and then you have to be that person who speaks out.
Yes, of course.
You're the person in the restaurant who causes the trouble.
Yes, but everybody has to understand that the safest option is to speak out. You can think that it is safer to shut up, but it's not true. And the better you understand what's happening, the more you realize that there is only one option, and that it is to speak out. And you can speak out at the kitchen table. You can speak out in front of a camera, in a podcast, as we do here, in the street, in a shop. It doesn't matter, but make sure that somewhere a dissonant voice sounds in society. A dissonant voice that breaks the frequency of the mainstream voice. And everybody, even someone who speaks out at the kitchen table or in a shop, can create a real change. And we do not know where the origin of change will be situated, but it might be at the kitchen table or in a shop. It might be in front of a television. I don't know. I don't care. But everybody has to practice speaking the truth. And the truth, I don't mean objective truth, which is always the same. With truth, I mean something you really feel, words of which you feel that they really contain something of yourself, of what you truly believe in. And if you try to give something of yourself through words to someone else, then you speak the truth. And truth is always something that goes against a dominant narrative. The ancient Greeks knew that already. They called it parasia, courageous speech, a speech that is always goes against the dominant narrative, the mainstream narrative, because if a society becomes convinced of one narrative, this narrative always becomes a lie, because reality is never identical to one narrative. There is always a kind of friction between the two. And if one narrative claims to be reality, claims to be to represent the facts, then it needs a voice that says that the narrative is incomplete, even a lie, deceitful. And that voice that represents this kind of knowledge that is lacking from the dominant narrative, that is truth. And in that way, what you have to do here is to practice speaking the truth. And that is the real revolution we can realize now. It is establishing a society in which truth has its place, in which it is recognized that it is necessary, and in which it is considered more important than the hollow rhetorics as we witness it now every day in the newspapers and on television.